The winter of 1926 had settled over London like a reluctant guest who refused to remove his coat, bringing with him a damp chill that seeped through keyholes and whispered along the corridors of even the most respectable establishments. In his Baker Street flat, Hercule Poirot sat before a fire that struggled valiantly against the invading cold, his small feet encased in patent leather shoes polished to such perfection that they reflected the flames like twin mirrors. The room smelled faintly of Russian cigarettes and the lavender water with which he disciplined his magnificent mustaches each morning. The invitation to Windermere. He was engaged in the delicate operation of arranging his correspondence into 3 precise piles: invitations to be declined, bills to be paid with reluctance, and letters from former clients who still believed themselves entitled to his attention. When the postman's knock reverberated through the flat like a gunshot in a cathedral, Hastings, who had been dozing over a copy of the Times in the adjoining room, started so violently that he upset his teacup. Poirot merely raised one expressive eyebrow and continued with his sorting until Mrs. Murchison, his housekeeper, appeared bearing a silver salver upon which reposed a single envelope. The envelope was of such heavy cream stock that it might have been cut from the hide of some aristocratic beast. The paper bore a watermark of interlaced stags, and the seal was crimson wax impressed with the same device. Poirot turned it over in his manicured hands with the reverence usually reserved for sacred relics. The handwriting on the front, his name and address executed in a bold, impatient slash of black ink, suggested a personality that brooked no refusal. "From the country, I think," Poirot murmured, breaking the seal with the silver letter opener that had once belonged to a Grand Duchess. The English aristocracy, they still believe that wax seals impress. Me, I am more impressed by the quality of the lies contained within. The invitation unfolded like a conjurer's silk handkerchief, revealing itself to be written in the same imperious hand. "Mr. Reginald Hargreaves requests the pleasure of Monsieur Hercule Poirot's company at Windermere Hall in the Cotswolds for a weekend of intellectual diversion commencing Friday the 22nd of January. Snow is promised. Murder is optional. Car will meet the 2:15 from Paddington." Poirot's mustaches twitched with amusement. The phrase "murder is optional" had been added in a different ink, as if an afterthought, and underlined twice. He recognized the name immediately: Reginald Hargreaves, shipping magnate, collector of Renaissance bronzes, and a man whose name appeared with unfortunate regularity in the society columns under headlines that ranged from "Millionaire weds actress half his age" to "Mystery surrounds death of Hargreaves' heir." The newspapers had been particularly exercised about Hargreaves some 18 months previously, when his second wife, former chorus girl turned society hostess, had been found dead at the foot of the grand staircase at Windermere Hall. The coroner's verdict had been accidental death, but the more scurrilous journals had hinted at everything from poisoned champagne to a push administered by persons unknown. Hargreaves himself had emerged from the scandal with his fortune intact, and his reputation merely dented, like a silver tray that has received one too many knocks but still gleams respectably. Poirot laid the invitation upon his desk and regarded it with the concentration he usually reserved for particularly recalcitrant clues. The phrase "intellectual diversion" suggested more than bridge parties and charades. Hargreaves was known to collect puzzles the way other men collected stamps or mistresses, and there were whispers of a famous locked-room problem that he claimed to have solved but refused to explain. The addition of "murder is optional" was either the blackest humor or the most blatant challenge. From the adjoining room came the sound of Hastings clearing his throat with the delicacy of a man who knows himself to be intruding upon genius. "I say, Poirot, wasn't Hargreaves the chap whose wife—" "Yes, mon ami, the very same." Poirot tapped the invitation with one finger. A man who buries two wives and one business partner under circumstances that the coroner describes as unfortunate is either the most unlucky fellow in England or the most fortunate in avoiding the hangman's rope. Hastings appeared in the doorway, his honest English face creased with concern. "You're not thinking of going, are you? The Cotswolds in January, beastly cold, and the trains are always late." "The trains, Hastings, are the least of my concerns. Consider, a millionaire invites the greatest detective in Europe to his country house for a weekend of intellectual diversion. He promises snow. He mentions murder. What does this suggest to you? That he's either planning to murder someone or wants you to prevent him from being murdered," Hastings replied promptly. "Though with Hargreaves it could be both. Precisement." Poirot rose and began to pace with the measured steps that always preceded his most profound cogitations. The English country house party, such a perfect setting for crime. Isolated, filled with secrets, cut off from the world by weather or circumstance. And this Hargreaves, he collects impossible crimes the way other men collect first editions. He stopped before the window where the gas lamps of Baker Street flickered through the gathering dusk like uncertain stars. "No, Hastings, I shall accept. But first we must learn more of our host and his establishment." The next 3 days were spent in what Poirot referred to as preparatory investigation, and Hastings called gossiping with your shady friends. Through channels both official and decidedly unofficial, Poirot assembled a dossier on Wintermere Hall and its inhabitants that would have done credit to Scotland Yard's finest. The house itself had been built in 1723 by Sir Giles Wintermere, a nabob who had returned from India with a fortune in diamonds and a collection of Hindu statues that had scandalized the county. The architecture was pure Georgian, symmetrical, restrained, with a portico supported by columns that had once graced a Maharaja's palace. The estate comprised 2,000 acres of prime Cotswold land, including a village, 3 farms, and a lake that was rumored to contain the remains of several inconvenient relatives. The current Hargreaves had purchased the property in 1905, the same year he married his first wife, the former Miss Amelia Carstairs of the Philadelphia Carstairs. Miss Carstairs had brought to the marriage a dowry of $500,000 and a passion for horticulture that manifested itself in the planting of a cedar of Lebanon in the exact center of the forecourt. Cedrus libani, Poirot learned, was not native to England and required special care to survive the climate. The tree had thrived, growing to a height of 60 feet and a girth that required 3 men to encompass. Local legend claimed that the first Mrs. Hargreaves had died beneath its branches during a thunderstorm, struck by lightning or by something more terrestrial, depending on which version one believed. Hargreaves himself was a self-made man who had begun his career as a cabin boy on a tramp steamer and ended it owning half the merchant fleet that flew the Red Ensign. He was 60 years old, built like a bull, with a voice that could be heard across 3 counties and a laugh that shattered crystal. His passions were bronze statues, young wives, and puzzles, particularly those involving locked rooms and impossible disappearances. The current household, according to Poirot's sources, consisted of Captain Marcus Lyle, Hargreaves' nephew and presumptive heir, late of the Mesopotamian campaign and currently engaged in drinking his way through the family cellars. Miss Diana Vale, an actress of the modern school who had been engaged to Captain Lyle for precisely 6 weeks and was rumored to have accepted the proposal only after being assured that the inheritance was secure. Dr. Evelyn Shaw, the family physician who had attended both Mrs. Hargreaves in their final illnesses, and who lived in a cottage on the estate, conveniently close to her most lucrative patient. Mr. Percival Finch, Hargreaves's solicitor, a dry stick of a man who had drafted 3 wills in as many years and was rumored to know where all the bodies were buried, literally, in the case of the first Mrs. Hargreaves. Mrs. Lydia Blackwood, Hargreaves' elder sister, who had kept house for him since the death of his second wife and who wore mourning as if it were her natural complexion. The staff was numerous and, according to Poirot's informants, remarkably loyal. A loyalty purchased, one suspected, with wages that exceeded those of cabinet ministers. On the morning of the 22nd, Poirot stood upon the platform at Paddington amid the hissing steam and shouting porters, his valise packed with the precision of a military campaign. He wore his usual town overcoat of exquisite cut, a muffler of pale gray cashmere, and carried in his pocket the little leather notebook in which he recorded observations that lesser minds would have dismissed as trivial. The train journey passed in a blur of frost-laced fields and skeletal trees. Poirot spent the time reviewing his dossier and making small, precise entries in his notebook. At Moreton-in-Marsh, the station was deserted save for a single Rolls-Royce Phantom that gleamed like a black beetle in the pale sunlight. The chauffeur touched his cap with the reverence due to royalty and opened the door with a flourish that suggested he had been practicing. The drive to Windermere took them through narrow lanes banked with snow, past stone walls and hedgerows that glittered with frost. The house appeared suddenly around a bend, rising from the landscape like a wedding cake that had been left out in the cold. Icicles hung from the portico like glass daggers, and the windows stared out at the approaching car with the blank expression of the recently bereaved. In the exact center of the forecourt stood the cedar of Lebanon, its branches heavy with snow, its trunk dark against the white landscape. Poirot felt a small, inexplicable chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. There was something about the tree, something that went beyond its incongruity in an English garden. It stood like a sentinel, or perhaps a monument to some forgotten grief. The front door opened before the car had come to a complete stop, and a butler of immense dignity appeared, flanked by 2 footmen who might have been carved from the same block of mahogany. The butler bowed with the solemnity of a priest at high mass. "Mr. Poirot, Mr. Hargreaves is expecting you. This way, if you please." The entrance hall was a cathedral of marble and mahogany, with a staircase that curved upward like the neck of a swan. A fire roared in a grate large enough to roast an ox, and above it hung a portrait of the first Mrs. Hargreaves. She had been dark-haired and dark-eyed with the kind of beauty that suggested secrets. In one hand she held a cedar cone, and her other hand rested upon the trunk of the great tree that now stood outside. The artist had captured something in her expression, something that might have been fear, or perhaps foreknowledge. Waiting in the drawing room were the other guests, arranged about the fire like pieces on a chessboard. Hargreaves himself dominated the center of the room, a massive figure in tweeds that strained at the seams. His face was red as roast beef, and his eyes glittered with the particular brilliance of a man who has drunk deeply and well. "Poirot, by Jove, you're smaller than the papers make out. Come in, come in. Warm your cockles. We've a surprise for you tonight that'll make your mustaches curl." The surprise, it transpired over an excellent tea served in Sevres cups, was to be a demonstration of the perfect locked-room murder. Hargreaves had caused to be constructed in the library a room within a room, oak-paneled windowless save for one small pane of reinforced glass, and fitted with a door of such complexity that it would have done credit to the Bank of England. "Inside," Hargreaves boomed, "we shall place a cedar sapling, symbol of eternity, don't you know? The door will be locked with a Yale lock of the latest design. The key will be placed in full view. And I wager 20 guineas that no one in this house can enter that room, commit murder, and leave it locked again from the inside without using the key." Poirot's eyes gleamed like winter stars. "A challenge, monsieur. Then Hercule Poirot, he accepts." Outside, the snow had begun to fall in earnest, thick, deliberate flakes that erased the world beyond the windows. The house settled into the particular silence that comes with heavy snowfall, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. In his bedroom that night, a chamber decorated in the Chinese taste with enough lacquer to furnish a pagoda, Poirot prepared for bed with his usual meticulous care. He arranged his dressing gown across the chair, placed his slippers at the precise angle that facilitated easy entry, and laid out upon the dressing table the small pistol that he carried when traveling in the country. One never knew, after all, when the criminal classes might take it into their heads to disturb one's slumbers. Before retiring, he stood at the window and watched the snow falling upon the cedar tree. The great branches swayed gently under their burden of white, and for a moment Poirot had the fanciful notion that the tree was watching the house with the same intensity that the house watched it. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock struck 11, and the sound carried clearly through the frozen air. Tomorrow, he thought, would bring the demonstration of the impossible crime, and perhaps the crime itself, the impossible corpse. The house slept uneasily beneath its blanket of snow, the kind of sleep that comes to old buildings when the wind prowls the chimneys and the radiators clank like restless ghosts. Poirot, who required precisely 6½ hours of repose and rarely achieved it in country houses where the mattresses were either too soft or too full of ancestral lumps, had fallen into a light doze when the scream came. It was not the theatrical shriek of a heroine discovering a mouse in her boudoir, but the raw, tearing sound of a human throat stripped of all pretense. It issued from the direction of the library wing, and carried with it the particular note of terror that suggested the screamer had seen something that could not exist. Poirot was in the corridor before the sound had fully died, his dressing gown of quilted silk flapping about his ankles like the wings of an indignant penguin. The electric lights had been dimmed for the night, leaving only the faint glow from the dying fire in the hall grate to illuminate the scene. Footsteps pattered behind him. Hastings in his paisley pajamas, Captain Lyle with a service revolver that looked too large for the occasion, and Miss Vale wrapped in something diaphanous that would have been more appropriate for a Mediterranean cruise than an English January. The library door stood ajar, which was wrong in itself. Hargreaves had been most particular that the inner chamber, the locked room proper, should remain sealed until morning when the demonstration would take place. Poirot pushed the door wider with the caution of a man who has learned that doors in country houses sometimes conceal more than cobwebs. The sight that greeted them was one that would remain etched in Poirot's memory, with the clarity of an etching by Mr. Piranesi. Reginald Hargreaves lay on his back beneath the cedar sapling which had grown, overnight, from its modest 6 feet to a monstrous 12, its branches scraping the ceiling like desperate fingers. The brass pot had burst asunder, soil spilling across the Persian rug in dark, fertile waves. Hargreaves' throat had been torn open with 5 parallel slashes that suggested claws rather than steel. Blood had soaked the rug in a perfect circle as though measured with compasses. His eyes stared upward at the cedar's needles with the fixed surprise of a man who has received an answer to a question he never thought to ask. The door to the inner chamber, the one that should have been locked, hung open on its hinges. The Yale lock gleamed mockingly, its mechanism undisturbed. The single window was latched from the inside, its frost patterns intact like lace upon the glass. On the table beside the corpse lay the key, a half-empty glass of whiskey, and a cedar cone split open to reveal not seeds, but a single gold cufflink engraved with the initials R.H. Captain Lyle made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Uncle Reggie," he said, and the revolver in his hand trembled. Dr. Shaw appeared as if conjured from the shadows, her medical bag already open, her face composed into the professional mask that doctors wear when confronted with the recently dead. She knelt beside the body with the economy of movement that comes from long practice. "Jugular severed," she said without looking up. "Death instantaneous, I should say, but these lacerations, 5 parallel wounds spaced exactly 1 inch apart, not a knife, almost like—" She hesitated, then finished with clinical precision, "teeth." Miss Vale fainted with the grace of a practiced actress, collapsing into the arms of Mr. Finch, who had materialized behind her like a particularly lugubrious spectre. Mrs. Blackwood crossed herself repeatedly, her black lace veil trembling with each genuflection. The butler Grimshaw stood in the doorway, his face the color of old parchment, while the footmen hovered behind him like nervous chorus boys. Poirot raised one hand in the gesture that always commanded silence. "Messieurs et mesdames, the little gray cells require order. Observe." He moved about the room with the precision of a dancer, his eyes cataloging every detail. The lock showed no signs of tampering. Its patent mechanism was the latest American design, guaranteed pick-proof by the manufacturers. The window latch was secure, and the snow beneath it lay in an unbroken drift that rose to the sill. The cedar sapling, now tree, had grown impossibly, its trunk thick as a man's thigh, its roots bursting through the pot and burrowing into the rug like desperate fingers. He picked up the cedar cone with the delicacy of a man handling nitroglycerin. The cufflink within was heavy gold, the kind of thing a man wears when he wishes to proclaim his consequence to the world. The initials R.H. were intertwined with a pattern of cedar leaves, and on the reverse was engraved a date, 1905. The year, Poirot recalled, that Hargreaves had married his first wife beneath the great cedar in the forecourt. From the corridor came the sound of heavy boots on parquet. The local constable, a man built like a shire horse and with roughly the same expression, appeared with snow still clinging to his helmet. "Telephone lines are down, sir," he announced to no one in particular. "Storms cut us off proper. No getting through to Oxford till the thaw." Poirot smiled without humor. "Then, mon ami, justice is in the hands of Hercule Poirot." He turned to the assembled company, his gaze moving from face to face like a searchlight. "Monsieur Hargreaves was locked in this room at midnight. The door was secured with a Yale lock. The key was in his pocket. Yet here he lies, murdered in a room locked from the inside beneath a tree that has grown 6 feet in 6 hours. Impossible, you say? Impossibility is the breakfast of champions." Dr. Shaw had risen and was examining the cedar with professional interest. "Gibberellic acid," she said suddenly. "Plant growth hormone, experimental stuff from Kew. Someone's been feeding it to the tree." She pointed to a faint discoloration on the leaves, tiny droplets that caught the light like dew. Captain Lyle laughed, a sound without mirth. "So the tree's the murderer? Shall we arrest it for assault with a deadly branch?" Poirot ignored him. He was studying the footprints that had appeared in the frost on the windowsill, bare human feet, size 9, but spaced impossibly far apart, as though the walker had taken steps of 7 feet. The prints led from the window to the cedar in the forecourt, then vanished into the snow as if the walker had been spirited away. The constable cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's something else. The great cedar in the garden, it's been disturbed, bark stripped in places like something climbed it." Poirot's eyes narrowed to slits. Something, or someone. He turned to the company. "Mesdames et messieurs, we have a locked room murder where the room was locked from the inside, a tree that grows overnight, footprints that defy gravity, and a cufflink that belongs to a dead man. The game, as my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes would say, is afoot." Outside, the snow continued to fall, thick and deliberate, erasing the world beyond Wintermere's walls. Inside, the cedar tree stood sentinel over its victim, its branches swaying gently as if in mourning. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 4, and the sound carried through the corridors like a funeral bell. The suspect's assembled morning arrived at Windermere like a bailiff, gray, relentless, and determined to collect its due. Snow had piled against the windows in drifts that turned the light into something aqueous and uncertain, so that the breakfast room felt like the interior of a glacier lit by candle stubs. Poirot entered with the measured tread of a man who has spent the night in fruitful communion with his little gray cells and has emerged victorious. He wore his town overcoat despite being indoors, a concession to the house's determination to remain at a temperature more suited to the preservation of game than the comfort of guests. The company was already assembled around the mahogany table, their faces arranged in attitudes of shock, suspicion, and barely suppressed avarice. Captain Lyle had abandoned his usual sunburnt nonchalance for the pallor of a man who has seen his future rearranged without consultation. He toyed with a slice of toast as though it were a loaded revolver. Miss Vale, wrapped in a dressing gown of peacock silk that clashed violently with the general gloom, kept her eyes fixed upon her plate where a single kipper lay untouched and reproachful. Dr. Shaw buttered toast with the mechanical precision of a surgeon performing an autopsy. Mr. Finch had arranged his legal documents in a perfect square before him, as though preparing to defend a client who was already beyond earthly aid. Mrs. Blackwood alone seemed unmoved, her black lace veil drawn across her face like a portcullis, her gloved hands busy with rosary beads that clicked softly with each murmured Ave. Poirot took his seat at the foot of the table, the place traditionally reserved for the least important guest, and regarded the assembly with the benign expression of a schoolmaster about to administer an unexpected examination. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, pouring coffee with the ceremony of a priest at the altar, "we find ourselves in the classic predicament of the English country house murder. Isolated by snow, bereft of official assistance, surrounded by persons each of whom possesses what my friend Hastings would call a thundering good motive. Let us therefore examine these motives with the clarity they deserve." He produced from his pocket a small leather notebook and flipped it open with a flourish that suggested he was about to reveal the combination to the Bank of England. Monsieur Hargreaves' will, as drafted by the excellent Monsieur Finch and witnessed by Dr. Shaw, is a document of fascinating complexity. To Captain Lyle, the principal beneficiary, £1,000,000 upon condition that he marries within the calendar year. To Mademoiselle Vale, £500,000, contingent upon the aforementioned marriage taking place. To Dr. Shaw, £250,000 for loyal services rendered, a phrase that has caused much raising of eyebrows in certain quarters. To Madame Blackwood, the residue of the estate, including Windermere Hall itself, unless, and this is the clause that interests Poirot enormously, the cedar of Lebanon in the forecourt is destroyed, in which case the entire property passes to the Maronite monastery of St. Charbel in Lebanon. A collective intake of breath circulated the table like a Mexican wave. Mrs. Blackwood's rosary beads clicked with renewed vigor. Captain Lyle's toast snapped in his fingers. Poirot continued unmoved. "We have, therefore, motives of inheritance, motives of jealousy, motives of professional necessity, and motives of, what shall we call it, religious horticulture. But let us not be distracted by the obvious. The method, mes amis, is everything. A man murdered in a locked room beneath a tree that grows 6 feet in 6 hours with wounds inflicted by what Dr. Shaw assures us are not human teeth. This is not a crime of passion but of calculation." He interviewed them one by one in the morning room, where the fire had been persuaded to burn with something approaching enthusiasm. Captain Lyle came first, smelling faintly of whiskey and cordite. "I was in the billiard room until 2, he said, his voice rough with more than morning hoarseness. "Finch was with me, ask him. We were discussing investments. His eyes flicked toward Miss Vale's photograph on the mantelpiece where she posed in the costume of Rosalind that had made her the toast of Shaftesbury Avenue. Miss Vale followed, her actress's poise restored but brittle. "I took a Veronal at 11, she said, twisting a diamond ring that had not been on her finger the previous evening. "Slept like the dead until the scream. Marcus, Captain Lyle, promised me security. I believed him." Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Dr. Shaw was brisk, professional, her hands still smelling faintly of carbolic. "The wounds are consistent with a theatrical prop, bear claws mounted on a leather glove. I've seen such things in music halls. As for the tree, gibberellic acid would account for the growth, but the quantity required—" She shrugged. "Someone with access to experimental horticulture." Mr. Finch adjusted his pince-nez with the air of a man preparing to deliver a closing argument. "I locked the door myself at midnight. Hargreaves insisted. He wanted the demonstration perfect. The key was in the lock on the outside. I removed it and placed it on the table in the library." His thin lips compressed. "Standard procedure." Mrs. Blackwood entered last, her veil lifted to reveal eyes red-rimmed but steady. "I prayed in the chapel until 1, she said, her voice the rustle of dead leaves. "My brother was obsessed with that tree. It killed our mother, heart failure beneath its branches in 1905. He kept the sapling in that room as a shrine to his guilt." She opened her hand to reveal the rosary beads, cedar wood, each one carved with exquisite precision. "Smell them," she said. Poirot did. Cedar, yes, but beneath it something metallic. Blood. That afternoon, Poirot examined the grounds with the thoroughness of a gardener preparing for the Chelsea flower show. The footprints from the library window were indeed extraordinary. Bare feet, size 9, spaced 7 feet apart as though the walker had been mounted on stilts or possessed of legs like a giraffe. They led across the virgin snow to the great cedar in the forecourt, circled its trunk twice, then vanished as completely as a conjurer's rabbit. The bark of the cedar showed fresh scars, pale against the dark wood, arranged in patterns that might have been claw marks or might have been something else entirely. In the library, Poirot discovered the ventilation grate above the locked room door. It was painted the same color as the wall and concealed behind a tapestry depicting the labors of Hercules, appropriately enough. The grate opened onto the attic above, where dust lay thick as funeral crepe. In the dust were marks, the rectangular outline of a box, the circular impression of a bottle, and, most intriguing, the print of a woman's shoe, narrow, high-heeled, size 5. Poirot's mustaches bristled with satisfaction. "The attic," he murmured, "is the key. But whose foot fits this Cinderella slipper of crime?" Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a tiny white lie covering the truth beneath. Inside, the suspects waited, their motives circling like wolves around a wounded stag. And somewhere in the house, the cedar sapling, now a tree, stood guard over its secret, its branches scraping the ceiling like fingernails on a coffin lid. Clues and red herrings. The afternoon light, thin and reluctant, filtered through the snow-plastered windows of the library and turned the blood on the rug into a dull, rust-colored lake. Poirot stood at its edge, hands clasped behind his back, and regarded the scene with the concentration of a painter assessing a flawed canvas. The cedar tree, now a monstrous 12-foot intruder, dominated the room, its branches spreading like the fingers of a drowning man. Soil from the burst brass pot had scattered in a perfect circle, and within that circle lay the cedar cone, the cufflink, the whiskey glass, still with a finger's breadth of amber liquid, and the key. Poirot photographed the arrangement in his mind with the precision of a Leica camera. He began with the tree. Dr. Shaw's diagnosis of gibberellic acid had been correct, but the quantity required to produce such growth was staggering. Poirot scraped a sample of the bark with his pocket knife and sealed it in an envelope marked Q, urgent. The leaves showed tiny puncture marks, as though injected with a hypodermic. Someone had been meticulous. Someone with access to experimental horticulture. Someone, perhaps, who had studied under the great Sir Geoffrey at the Royal Botanic Gardens. The ventilation grate above the door yielded more. Poirot climbed the library steps borrowed from the butler with the solemnity of a priest borrowing the host, and examined the screws. They were bright, freshly turned. The grate itself had been removed and replaced within the last 24 hours. Behind it, the duct led upward into darkness. Poirot produced his electric torch, a gift from the Belgian Sûreté, and shone it into the void. The beam caught a glint of metal, a brass pulley newly oiled with a thin cotton rope still threaded through it. The rope ended in a noose-like loop stained dark at the bottom, plant food perhaps, or blood. In the attic, the dust told its own story. The rectangular outline of a box, approximately 18 inches by 12, had been dragged across the floorboards, leaving a trail that ended at the chimney breast. Beside the trail, the circular impression of a bottle and the delicate print of the woman's shoe. Poirot knelt and measured. Size 5, narrow with a Louis heel. Miss Vale's foot, perhaps, or Dr. Shaw's. Both women wore fashionable shoes, though Dr. Shaw's were more practical. He took a sample of the dust, fine gray with particles of cedar pollen, and sealed it in another envelope. The pulley system was ingenious. A bottle of concentrated gibberellic acid could be suspended above the grate, its contents dripping slowly onto the sapling below. A clockwork timer, Poirot found the remnants jammed at 2:47 a.m., would regulate the flow. The murderer had entered the attic, set the timer, then descended through the priest's hole, which Poirot discovered behind a false panel in the chimney. The priest's hole opened into the locked room via a sliding panel concealed behind the tapestry of Hercules. The panel was operated by a cedarwood lever carved to resemble a branch. The leverage was perfect. A child could have worked it. But the door remained locked from the inside. Poirot examined the Yale lock for the third time. The key was still on the table, but the lock itself showed a hairline scratch on the inside of the keyhole. Someone had used a duplicate, or something that functioned as one. He thought of Mrs. Blackwood's rosary beads, cedar wood, carved. One bead had been slightly larger than the others. A key, perhaps. A cedarwood key that fit the original lock before it was replaced in 1925. Downstairs, the suspects were restless. Captain Lyle had taken to pacing the morning room with the energy of a caged tiger. Miss Vale had discovered a bottle of sal volatile and was applying it liberally. Dr. Shaw had retired to her room with a migraine, or so she claimed. Mr. Finch was drafting a codicil to the will that no longer had a testator. Mrs. Blackwood sat in the chapel, her rosary clicking like a telegraph machine. Poirot summoned them to the library at 4 o'clock, when the light was failing and the snow had begun to fall again in thick, deliberate flakes. He stood beneath the cedar tree, which now scraped the ceiling with a sound like fingernails on wood. "Mes amis," he began, "we have clues. But clues, like red herrings, are designed to mislead. Let us separate the wheat from the chaff." He held up the cedar cone. This contained the cufflink of the first Mrs. Hargreaves. Why? To suggest a supernatural agency? The ghost of the cedar, perhaps? No. It is a distraction. He pointed to the whiskey glass. Poison? No. The whiskey is pure, but the glass was placed after death. The angle of the spill is wrong for a man drinking at a table. He indicated the footprints in the snow. 7-foot strides. Stilts, mes amis. Stilts padded with cedar bark to leave no trace. The murderer crossed the snow, climbed the great cedar in the forecourt, hence the bark scars, and entered the attic via the roof. The footprints vanished because the stilts were discarded in the cedar's branches. Miss Vale gasped. But the attic door was locked. From the inside, Poirot agreed, by the cedarwood key. The original key carved by Elias Khoury, the Lebanese gardener, for his lover in 1905. Mrs. Blackwood kept it as a rosary bead. She did not know its purpose. Or did she? Mrs. Blackwood's veil trembled. My brother killed Elias, buried him beneath the cedar. I knew. I kept the key. Poirot nodded. But the murderer needed it. They stole it from your rosary last night, replaced it with a duplicate bead you did not notice. He turned to Captain Lyle. You discovered the letters in the tin box beneath the cedar's roots. You blackmailed Dr. Shaw. She signed the false death certificate for the first Mrs. Hargreaves. You needed the marriage to secure the inheritance. You used the stilts from Miss Vale's theater props, the bear-claw glove from the billiard room. Lyle laughed. Circumstantial. You have no proof. Poirot smiled. I have the shoe print, size 5, but Dr. Shaw wears a 6. Miss Vale a 4. The print is yours, Captain. You wore your fiancé's shoes to mislead. You are a size 9 in men's, but a 5 in women's. Vanity, mon ami. You thought the snow would cover your tracks. It did not. Lyle lunged for the door. Poirot tripped him with his cane. The little detective stood over him, eyes glittering. Complications and twists. The confession should have ended it, but country houses have memories longer than their corridors, and Wintermere was not finished with its revelations. Captain Lyle lay trussed in the butler's pantry under the watchful eye of the constable, his face a study in ruined arrogance. Miss Vale had been escorted to her room in a state of collapse that required both sal volatile and smelling salts. Dr. Shaw had vanished into the West Wing with her medical bag, ostensibly to treat Mrs. Blackwood for shock. Mr. Finch was drafting a statement for the Oxford police that already ran to 6 pages. And Poirot, who believed that the perfect crime was like the perfect soufflé, ruined by the slightest tremor, felt the ground shift beneath his patent leather shoes. It began with the cedar itself. At precisely 4:17 p.m., while Poirot was examining the priest's hole for the 3rd time, the tree gave a sound like a ship's timber cracking in a storm. A branch, thick as a man's thigh, detached from the trunk and crashed to the rug, missing Poirot by inches. From the hollow revealed in the trunk spilled a cascade of objects. A woman's kid glove stiffened with old blood. A photograph of the first Mrs. Hargreaves in Lebanese costume, and a second cedar cone. This one contained not a cufflink but a tiny glass vial stoppered with wax. The label in faded ink read Strychnine 1 grain. Dr. Shaw appeared as if summoned by the crash, her face pale but composed. The tree was hollow, she said. Someone used it as a hiding place. She took the vial with professional caution. Enough to kill a regiment. Poirot's mustaches bristled. But the tree grew overnight. The hollow should have been crushed. Unless, Shaw said slowly, the growth was guided. The hormone injected only into the outer layers. The core remained intact. The implications were staggering. The murderer had not merely forced the tree to grow. They had engineered a living safe. But why? The answer came with the second impossibility. At 4:55 p.m., Grimshaw the butler entered the library bearing a silver salver. Upon it lay a single cedar cone, freshly split. Inside, a lock of blonde hair tied with blue ribbon, Miss Vale's color, and a note in block capitals. The tree remembers, you are next. Miss Vale, summoned from her room, took one look and fainted for the 2nd time that day. This time, however, her collapse was less theatrical. Dr. Shaw caught her before she hit the floor and eased her into a chair. She's been drugged, Shaw announced after a quick examination. Veronal, a heavy dose. Poirot's eyes narrowed. But she claimed to have taken Veronal last night. This is fresh. The drug had been administered within the hour. Someone had entered Miss Vale's room while the house was in uproar over Lyle's confession. The windows were locked, the door bolted from the inside. Another locked room. Poirot ordered the house searched. The results were bewildering. In Dr. Shaw's medical bag, a second vial of strychnine, identical to the one in the tree. In Mrs. Blackwood's chapel, a bear claw glove, the twin of the one used on Hargreaves, hidden behind the altar. In Mr. Finch's briefcase, the tin box from beneath the cedar's roots containing the love letters from Elias Corey to the first Mrs. Hargreaves. Each discovery pointed to a different culprit. Each was planted with the precision of a stage manager setting props. By dusk, the snow had stopped, but the temperature plummeted. The telephone lines remained dead. The constable's motorcycle refused to start. Wintermere was a prison with walls of ice. Poirot gathered the remaining suspects in the drawing room. The fire had been built up to a roar, but the warmth did not reach their faces. Dr. Shaw's hands trembled as she poured tea. Mrs. Blackwood's rosary beads were missing 3 beads now. Mr. Finch had developed a nervous tic in his left eye. "Mes amis," Poirot began, "we have been played like trout on a line." Captain Lyle confessed yes, but the confession was too perfect. The stilts, the bear claw glove, the shoe print, all convenient. Someone wished us to believe the case closed. He produced the strychnine vial from the tree. "This is not the poison that killed Hargreaves. His wounds were from claws, not convulsions. This vial was planted to incriminate Dr. Shaw." He held up the bear claw glove from the chapel. "This is the left hand. The murder weapon was the right. The pair was separated deliberately." He displayed the tin box. "These letters were moved from the cedar's roots to Mr. Finch's briefcase between 3 and 4 o'clock. I watched the briefcase. No one entered the morning room." Mrs. Blackwood spoke for the first time, her voice a cracked bell. "The house has passages, priests' holes. My brother showed them to me when we were children. One runs from the chapel to the attic, another from the west wing to the library cellar." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Then the murderer is still among us, and they are desperate." At 6:30 p.m., the third crime. Dr. Shaw's scream brought them running to the west wing. Her door was locked from the inside. The key was on the dressing table beside a cedar cone containing a single cedar bead, the missing one from Mrs. Blackwood's rosary. Dr. Shaw lay across her bed, throat slashed with the same 5 parallel wounds. But this time the weapon lay beside her, the right-hand bear claw glove, blood still wet. The window was open. Snow blew in, already covering footprints that led from the sill to the cedar stump in the forecourt, now mysteriously returned to its original position. The stride was 7 feet, the stilts again. But Dr. Shaw had been alive at 6:15. Poirot had spoken to her in the corridor. She had been carrying her medical bag. The bag now lay open on the floor, its contents scattered. Among them, a hypodermic syringe and an empty ampule labeled gibberellic acid concentrate. Poirot examined the body. The wounds were fresh, but the blood had begun to congeal in a peculiar pattern. 5 parallel lines, but the central one deeper, as though the claw had slipped. He found a hair caught in the glove's leather, dark, coarse, with a slight wave. Not Dr. Shaw's, hers was straight and auburn. Not Miss Vale's, blonde. Not Mrs. Blackwood's, gray. Mr. Finch's hair was dark and wavy. The lawyer had vanished. They found him in the attic, hanging from the pulley rope. His neck was broken. In his pocket, the cedarwood key now snapped in 2. On the floor beneath him, a woman's shoe size 5 Louis heel. But the shoe was left-footed and the print in the dust had been right. Poirot cut Finch down with the library steps. The lawyer's eyes stared at nothing. His tongue protruded, black and swollen. Strychnine. The revelation. The house held its breath as the clock struck 10, each chime falling into the snow-muffled silence like a pebble into a frozen well. Poirot had ordered every lamp in the great hall to be lit, so that the chandeliers blazed like captured suns, and the shadows retreated to the corners where they belonged. The remaining survivors, Mrs. Blackwood veiled in black lace, Miss Vale wrapped in a blanket and trembling, Dr. Shaw's absence a cold space at the table, sat in a half-circle before the fireplace. The constable stood behind them, helmet in hand, his face the color of putty. Poirot himself occupied the center of the rug, small, immaculate, the broken cedarwood key resting on a velvet cushion like a relic. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, his voice soft yet carrying to the rafters, "we have pursued the impossible across 3 murders, 2 locked rooms and 1 tree that walks. We have been led by footprints that stride 7 feet, by poisons that appear and vanish, by confessions that collapse like houses of cards. Tonight, Hercule Poirot will show you the architecture of the truth." He lifted the cushion. This key, carved from cedar in 1905 by Elias Khoury for his lover Amelia Hargreaves, opens the original lock of the inner library door. In 1925, the lock was replaced with a Yale. The cedar key became useless, except as a rosary bead for Madame Blackwood. Yet it was used last night to lock Dr. Shaw's door from the inside. How? Because the Yale lock in Dr. Shaw's room was not a Yale. It was the original lock, removed from the library and reinstalled in her bedroom 3 days ago. Miss Vale gasped. Mrs. Blackwood's veil trembled. Poirot continued. The substitution was simple. The library Yale was swapped with Dr. Shaw's bedroom lock while the household was at dinner. The cedar key stolen from Madame's rosary worked perfectly. The murderer entered Dr. Shaw's room through the priest's hole that connects the west wing to the attic, killed her with the bear claw glove, locked the door from the inside using the cedar key, then exited via the attic and the roof. The open window and the 7-foot footprints were theater, stilts again, padded with cedar bark, carried across the snow and discarded in the great cedar's branches. He turned to the constable. "You, mon ami, saw the stump return to the forecourt at dawn. It had never left. The moving cedar was the sapling from the locked room carried out on the stilts and planted temporarily in the stump's place. The real stump remained buried beneath snow. An illusion, like all the rest." Mrs. Blackwood's voice was a whisper. "But Mr. Finch, hanged in the attic. Finch was the dupe, not the murderer." Poirot produced the dark wavy hair caught in the bear claw glove. "This is Finch's hair. He was killed first, strychnine in his tea at 6 o'clock, then strung up to suggest suicide. The left-footed shoe in the attic was planted. Finch wore a size 9. The murderer needed a scapegoat after Lyle's confession failed. He laid out the clues like cards in a game of patience." Poirot's gaze settled on Mrs. Blackwood. "Madam, you knew every passage. You planted the cedar sapling in the locked room 20 years ago as a shrine to Elias. You tended it with hormones stolen from Q. Your late husband was a patron. You discovered the letters beneath the great cedar's roots. You learned that your brother murdered Elias out of jealousy and buried him there. You waited. When Hargreaves announced the demonstration, you saw your chance." Mrs. Blackwood's hands clutched the rosary so tightly the remaining beads cracked. "He destroyed everything," she said, her voice steady now. "My mother died beneath that tree because he forced her to watch Elias's execution. Amelia poisoned herself rather than live with him. I kept the cedar key all these years. When he mocked me with his murder optional, I gave him murder obligatory." She described it calmly as though reciting a recipe. She had entered the locked room via the priest's hole at 2:30 a.m., wearing the bear claw glove, a relic from her husband's African travels. Hargreaves was drunk, asleep in the chair. She slashed his throat, planted the cufflink to suggest the past returning, then activated the pulley with the hormone bottle. She locked the door from the inside with the cedar key, exited through the attic, and crossed the snow on stilts to the great cedar, where she hid the stilts in the branches. Dr. Shaw had discovered the hormone theft and confronted her. Mrs. Blackwood killed her the same way. Swapped locks, priest's hole, stilts. Finch had seen her on the roof and threatened exposure. She poisoned his tea, hanged him, and planted the evidence to frame him posthumously. Miss Vale had been drugged to keep her silent. She had guessed about the stilts. Captain Lyle's confession was genuine but incomplete. He had planned to blackmail Hargreaves with the letters, but Mrs. Blackwood acted first. Poirot concluded softly, "You used the cedar as your weapon, madame. Not the tree itself, but the guilt it represented. You made it grow, made it walk, made it remember. But the little gray cells, they remember too." Mrs. Blackwood rose. The veil fell away, revealing a face carved by 20 years of hatred. "The monastery will have the house," she said. "Let the monks pray over the bones of Elias. I have avenged him." Justice served. The snow had ceased during the night, leaving Wintermere under a sky the color of polished steel. Dawn crept over the Cotswolds like a cautious thief, revealing the great cedar in the forecourt as a dark sentinel against the white, its branches drooping with the weight of ice. Beneath it lay Mrs. Lydia Blackwood, rigid in death, her black lace veil frozen to her cheek, the cedar wood key still clutched in her gloved hand. The rosary beads were scattered across the snow in a perfect circle, each bead a tiny monument to 20 years of calculated grief. The constable stood over her, helmet in hand, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Poirot arrived with the measured tread of a man who has solved the puzzle but finds no joy in the solution. He knelt beside the body with the reverence usually reserved for cathedrals. Mrs. Blackwood's face was serene, the lines of bitterness smoothed by frost. Her eyes stared upward at the cedar's branches as though expecting absolution from the tree itself. Poirot closed them gently with 2 fingers. "Pauvre madame," he murmured. "You serve justice, but justice, she is a harsh mistress." The inquest was held in the library 3 days later, once the snowplows had carved a path to the outside world. The Oxford police arrived in force, 2 sergeants, a photographer, and a coroner who looked as though he had been dragged from his fireside against his will. They photographed the locked room, the cedar sapling, now reduced to a stump by the local constabulary's axe. The priest's holes, the stilts retrieved from the great cedar's branches, and the bear claw gloves, one bloodied, one pristine. They took statements from Miss Vale, still pale but composed, Captain Lyle, who had spent the intervening days in the wine cellar under lock and key, and Mr. Finch's corpse, which had been laid out in the billiard room with more dignity than it had known in life. Poirot gave his evidence with the clarity of a man reciting a well-rehearsed soliloquy. He began with the invitation, murder optional, and ended with Mrs. Blackwood's frozen confession beneath the cedar. He explained the mechanics, the swapped locks, the gibberellic acid pulley, the stilts padded with cedar bark, the priest's holes known only to the family. He detailed the motives. Hargreaves' murder of Elias Khoury in 1905, the false death certificate for Amelia Hargreaves, the clause in the will that would have disinherited Mrs. Blackwood if the cedar were destroyed. He concluded with the psychological portrait of a woman who had tended her hatred like a rare orchid, waiting for the perfect moment to let it bloom. The coroner, a man with eyebrows like hedgerows, cleared his throat. And the death of Mrs. Blackwood herself? Exposure, Poirot said simply. She walked into the snow at -15 degrees Celsius, wearing only her mourning dress. She sat beneath the cedar and waited. The cedar key was her suicide note. Captain Lyle was charged with conspiracy to blackmail and released on bail. The letters beneath the cedar's roots were sufficient evidence, but his confession had been under duress. Miss Vale announced her intention to return to the stage, declaring that Windermere had cured her of any desire for country life. The monastery of St. Charbel in Lebanon received title to the estate, though the monks were said to be puzzled by the bequest of a Georgian manor in the Cotswolds. The great cedar was felled on the coroner's orders, its roots exhumed with the solemnity of an archaeological dig. Beneath them lay the bones of Elias Khoury, still clutching a cedar seed in his skeletal hand. The seed was planted in the monastery's courtyard in Beirut, where it thrives to this day. Poirot remained at Windermere for the exhumation, supervising the removal of the cedar with the care of a man dismantling a bomb. When the last root was severed, he stood in the empty forecourt and regarded the scar in the earth. "The tree is gone," he said to Hastings, who had arrived with the police. "No, but the memory remains. Some roots go deeper than soil." The final piece of justice was served in London 6 weeks later. Dr. Evelyn Shaw's body was re-examined at Poirot's request. The slash wounds were indeed from the bear claw glove, but the angle suggested a left-handed assailant. Mrs. Blackwood had been right-handed. Poirot's little gray cells, never satisfied with a single solution, had noted the discrepancy. A second inquest revealed that Dr. Shaw had been dead before the throat was slashed, strychnine in her evening cocoa administered by Mrs. Blackwood to silence her permanently. The slash was post-mortem, a flourish to match Hargreaves' murder. The verdict was amended, murder by person or persons unknown, but the case was closed. Mrs. Blackwood's frozen body had confessed enough. On the train back to London, Poirot sat opposite Hastings, who was reading the Morning Post's account of the Cedar Catastrophe, with the avid interest of a man who has missed the drama but enjoys the reviews. "I say, Poirot," Hastings said, folding the paper, "you never told me why Mrs. Blackwood left the cedar key in her hand. A message." Poirot gazed out at the frost-laced fields. "She wished the tree to have the last word, mon ami. The key opened the door to her brother's crime, to Elias's grave, to her own heart. By dying with it, she locked the past forever." At Baker Street, Poirot found a parcel waiting. Inside, a small cedar sapling in a brass pot and a note in a spidery hand. "From the monks of St. Charbel, may it grow in peace." Poirot placed it on his windowsill where it caught the pale February sun. Each morning he watered it with sirop de menthe, and each evening he regarded it with the wariness of a man who knows that some trees remember. The cedar's confession. The cedar sapling on Poirot's windowsill had grown 3 inches by the first day of March, its needles a vivid green against the London soot. Poirot regarded it each morning with the mixture of affection and suspicion he usually reserved for beautiful women who lied well. The parcel from the monks of St. Charbel had included no further note, only a small brass plaque engraved with the words, "Planted in memory of Elias Khoury, 1906 to 1926. Poirot had polished the plaque himself, then placed it beneath the pot where the sunlight caught the letters like frost on a grave. He had intended to close the file on Windermere Hall with his usual efficiency, a final entry in the leather notebook, a letter to the Oxford police, a quiet dinner of sole meunière and a half-bottle of sauterne. Yet the case clung to him like cedar pollen, invisible but persistent. Certain details refused to lie flat. The precise angle of Dr. Shaw's post-mortem wounds, the absence of frostbite on Mrs. Blackwood's fingers despite her hours in the snow, the fact that the great cedar's roots had been severed with a saw rather than an axe. These were not contradictions, they were harmonies in a minor key suggesting a second melody beneath the first. On the 15th of March, a letter arrived in an envelope of heavy creamstock sealed with crimson wax and the crest of a leaping stag. The handwriting was familiar, bold, impatient, alive. Poirot broke the seal with the silver letter opener that had once belonged to a Grand Duchess and unfolded the single sheet. Monsieur Poirot, the tree remembers. So do I. Meet me beneath the cedar at Wintermere midnight, the Ides of March. Come alone. Poirot's mustaches bristled like a cat's whiskers before a storm. Reginald Hargreaves had been dead for 2 months, his throat slashed, his body photographed and buried. Yet the ink was fresh, the paper scented faintly with cedar oil. Poirot turned the letter over. On the reverse, in smaller script, "The monks lied. The roots were not all." He traveled to the Cotswolds that afternoon, the train rattling through fields where the snow had retreated to sullen patches in the hedgerows. Wintermere Hall stood empty, its windows boarded, the forecourt a raw wound where the great cedar had been. The monastery had sent a caretaker, a silent Lebanese monk named Brother Elias, who opened the gates with a key that looked suspiciously like a rosary bead. At 11:47 p.m., Poirot stood beneath the stump of the cedar, the night air sharp with the scent of resin and turned earth. The moon was a thin blade overhead, and the stars were bright enough to read by. He carried no weapon. The little gray cells were armament enough. At midnight precisely, a figure emerged from the priest's hole that had once connected the library to the attic. It was tall, cloaked in black, and moved with the stiffness of a man who has spent weeks in hiding. The hood fell back, revealing a face Poirot had last seen in a photograph above the fireplace. Reginald Hargreaves, alive, the scar across his throat a pale line against tanned skin. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered. "The impossible. She is not always impossible." Hargreaves' laugh was the same barking seal Poirot remembered, though weaker. "You always were a theatrical little beggar, Poirot. I had to die convincingly. The blood was pig's, the throat wound superficial. Dr. Shaw's handiwork before Lydia silenced her." The cedar sapling hid the pulley that raised the corpse into the attic. "Lydia thought she killed me. She killed a dummy dressed in my clothes." He stepped closer and Poirot saw the truth. The man was gaunt, his eyes fever-bright. "I discovered the letters in 1905, Elias and Amelia. I buried him beneath the cedar, yes. But Amelia didn't poison herself. Lydia did, strychnine in her tea, then the false certificate. Lydia wanted the estate. She waited 20 years, then staged my murder to trigger the monastery clause. She would inherit, then burn the cedar and claim the forfeit." Poirot's mind raced. "The locked room? My design. The priest's hole, the pulley, the hormone. All to create the perfect impossible crime. I intended to expose Lydia at the demonstration. Instead, she used my own trap against me. I escaped through the attic, lived in the priest's hole for weeks on stolen food. Finch found me, threatened to turn me in for insurance fraud. Lydia killed him, hanged him to look like suicide. Dr. Shaw knew too much. Lydia poisoned her, slashed the throat post-mortem to match my murder." He gestured to the stump. "The monks helped me. They dug up Elias's bones, yes, but they also dug a tunnel from the chapel to the cedar's roots. I've been living beneath the tree, Poirot. Like Elias. The cedar protected me." Poirot studied the man. "And now the truth." Hargreaves produced a document from his cloak, the original will witnessed in 1905, leaving everything to Elias Khoury's heirs. "Lydia forged the later wills. This is legal. The monastery gets nothing. Elias's family, my family, Poirot, Amelia was pregnant, gets Wintermere." He sank to his knees in the raw earth. "I staged my death to escape Lydia's madness, but I cannot live as a ghost. Arrest me for fraud if you must, but give Elias justice." Poirot considered. The little gray cells whirred like a well-oiled machine. "Fraud, yes. But murder? No, Hargreaves had been the victim, not the killer. Lydia's confession beneath the cedar had been genuine, for her crimes, if not his. He helped Hargreaves to his feet. "You will come with me to Oxford. You will tell your story. The courts, they are kinder to the resurrected than to the fraudulent. And Elias, his seed grows in Beirut, his bones will rest in consecrated ground." They walked together through the priest's hole, past the hollow where the cedar had hidden its secrets. In the library, Poirot found the final piece, a cedar cone beneath the stump's plaque, containing a lock of dark hair, Elias's, and a note in Arabic. "The tree forgives." Brother Elias was waiting with tea. The monastery would keep the house, but as stewards for Elias's heirs, a family in Beirut who had never known their inheritance. Hargreaves would live quietly in Lebanon, tending the cedar that grew from his father's seed. Departure in snow. The train to Paddington left Morton in Marsh at 10:30, its whistle a thin, mournful note against the white silence of the Cotswolds. Poirot stood on the platform in his town overcoat and gray suede gloves, valise at his feet, watching the locomotive breathe steam like a dragon roused from winter sleep. Hastings had remained in Oxford to assist the police with final statements. Poirot traveled alone, as he preferred when the little gray cells required the hush of solitude to polish their conclusions. The snow had begun again during the night, soft and deliberate, erasing the scars of the past weeks. Windermere Hall was already half buried, its boarded windows blind, the raw stump of the cedar in the forecourt smoothed into a gentle mound. Brother Elias had stood at the gates as Poirot departed, pressing into his hand a small cedar cone sealed with wax. "For the journey," the monk had said in accented English. "The tree travels with you now." Poirot boarded the first-class carriage, settled into a corner seat facing the engine, and placed the cone on the small table beside his gloves. The train lurched forward, iron wheels singing on frost-stiff rails. Outside, the landscape unrolled in monochrome, stone walls laced with snow, hedgerows bent like old men, the occasional church spire pricking the sky. He watched it all with the detachment of a man who has solved the puzzle and now contemplates the box it came in. At Didcot, a porter brought tea in a thick railway cup. Poirot sipped it black, no sugar, and opened his leather notebook to the final page. In his neat continental hand he wrote, "Case closed. Windermere Hall, 2228 January 1926. Victims Reginald Hargreaves, presumed Percival Finch, Dr. Evelyn Shaw. Perpetrator Lydia Blackwood, deceased. Complication, Hargreaves alive, fraudulently deceased 22 Jan 15 Mar. Motive, vengeance for Elias Khoury, 1905. Resolution, estate to Khoury heirs via monastery stewardship. Cedar seed planted Beirut, 1926. Observation, some trees outlive their murderers." He closed the notebook, slipped it into his breast pocket, and turned to the cedar cone. With the silver letter opener, he broke the wax seal. Inside lay not a message, but a single seed, dark and glossy, and a curl of cedar bark inscribed in tiny Arabic letters. "Forgiveness grows slowly." Poirot smiled without humor. The monks understood symbolism better than most detectives. The train gathered speed. Fields gave way to villages, villages to the first straggling suburbs of London. Poirot's thoughts drifted to the survivors. Captain Lyle had sailed for Canada with a third-class ticket and a letter of introduction to a timber firm, his inheritance reduced to a modest annuity, his pride in tatters. Miss Vale had taken a 6-month contract in Birmingham Rep, vowing never to play another country house comedy. Mr. Finch's remains had been released to a spinster sister in Tunbridge Wells, who had buried him beneath a stone that read simply, "Solicitor." Dr. Shaw's medical bag had been returned to her alma mater with a brass plate, "In memory of faithful service," and Hargreaves, alive, exiled, redeemed, had departed for Beirut on a tramp steamer, carrying only a suitcase and the original 1905 will. Poirot had shaken his hand at the docks, noting the tremor in the magnate's fingers. "You will plant cedars, monsieur," Poirot had said. "But remember, some roots choke the gardener." The train slowed for Reading. A woman in a green cloche hat boarded and took the seat opposite. She carried a small dog in a wicker basket and smelled of violet water. Poirot inclined his head politely. She responded with a shy smile. For a moment, the carriage was almost companionable. At Slough, the snow turned to sleet, streaking the windows in gray rivulets. Poirot produced from his valise a copy of the Times folded to the agony column. An advertisement caught his eye. He folded the paper with a sigh. The Cedar would travel further than he. Paddington arrived under a sky the color of wet slate. Porters shouted, taxis hissed on the wet concourse, the air smelled of coal smoke and fried onions. Poirot collected his valise, tipped the guard with a crisp half-crown, and stepped into the stream of humanity. A newsboy thrust a late edition at him. "Cedar murder solved, woman's frozen confession." The headline was already yesterday's fish wrapper. He took a taxicab to Baker Street. The driver, a cheerful cockney, attempted conversation about the weather. Poirot responded in monosyllables, his mind elsewhere. At the flat, Mrs. Murchison had left a fire banked low and a note. "Welsh rarebit in the warming oven, sir. Mind the sapling, it's grown another inch." The cedar sapling stood on the windowsill exactly as he had left it, but the brass pot had been replaced with a larger one of plain terracotta. A new plaque leaned against it, engraved in Brother Elias's careful hand. "Planted in memory of all who waited beneath the cedar." The little tree had indeed grown. Its topmost needle brushed the curtain rail. Poirot watered it with sirop de menthe, then stood back to admire the effect. Green against London brick, life against soot, a small victory. He dined alone, the rarebit excellent, the sauterne chilled to perfection. Afterward he sat in his armchair, feet to the fire, and opened the cedar cone from Wintermere one last time. The seed he planted in a saucer of cotton wool. The bark curl he placed between the pages of his notebook beside the final entry. Then he took a fresh sheet of cream paper and wrote in his precise hand, "To the monastery of Saint Charbel, the cedar thrives. So does justice, though more slowly. Should Mr. Hargreaves require a detective in Beirut, he knows where to find me. With the compliments of Hercule Poirot." He sealed the letter, addressed it, and placed it on the salver for the morning post. Outside, the sleet had turned to rain, washing the last of the snow from the streets. London moved on, indifferent to the dramas of country houses and frozen confessions. Poirot rose, adjusted the sapling so its branches caught the lamplight, and prepared for bed. As he turned down the coverlet, he noticed something on the pillow, a single cedar needle, dark and fragrant. He picked it up, twirled it between thumb and finger, and smiled. "The tree travels," he murmured. "But Poirot, he is always one step ahead." Camilog. The little gray cells. The cedar on Poirot's windowsill reached the ceiling by midsummer, its branches spreading like a green fan against the London sky. Mrs. Murchison had threatened resignation twice, once when a needle pierced her best duster, again when the pot cracked the parquet. But Poirot placated her with a new Hoover and a fortnight at Margate. The tree had become a fixture, like the ormolu clock or the silver cigarette box. And visitors, Hastings, Jap, even the occasional Duchess, were required to duck beneath its lower limbs to reach the armchair. Poirot watered it each morning with sirop de menthe, pruned it with nail scissors, and addressed it formally as Monsieur Cedre when no one was listening. On the first anniversary of the Wintermere case, a parcel arrived from Beirut. It contained a photograph, Reginald Hargreaves, thinner but upright, standing beside a cedar sapling that had grown to shoulder height in the monastery courtyard. Behind him, the mountains of Lebanon rose in sun-baked tiers. On the reverse, in Hargreaves' impatient scrawl, "The boy is Elias's grandson. He asks after the little Belgian who gave him a forest." Enclosed was a cedar cone split to reveal a single gold cufflink, the mate to the one found beside the corpse. Poirot placed it in his curiosity cabinet beside the broken cedar wood key and the bark curl inscribed with Arabic forgiveness. He spent the afternoon in his garden chair on the flat roof, the cedar's scent mingling with the city's coal smoke. Hastings arrived at 4, bearing a bottle of decent claret and the news that Captain Lyle had been arrested in Vancouver for smuggling opium in cedar crates. "Poetic justice," Hastings declared, pouring with a flourish. Poirot merely raised an eyebrow. "Poetic, perhaps, but justice? None. The crates were empty. Lyle smuggles only his own despair now." They drank in companionable silence, watching the sun sink behind the chimneys. Below, London roared and clattered, indifferent to the dramas of country houses and resurrected millionaires. Poirot's thoughts drifted to the survivors. Miss Vale had married her leading man and retired to a villa in Capri, where she grew lemons instead of neuroses. Brother Elias had been ordained and now tended the Beirut cedar with the devotion of a man repaying a debt. The monastery had turned Windermere into a retreat for war widows, its priests' holes sealed with concrete and prayer. At dusk, Poirot descended to the flat and opened his notebook to a fresh page. He wrote with the concentration of a monk illuminating a manuscript. Reflections on the Cedar Catastrophe, 1 year hence. He closed the notebook, placed it beside the curiosity cabinet, and turned to the cedar. Its topmost branch had grown through the open window and now brushed the ceiling rose. Poirot fetched the library steps, borrowed permanently from the British Museum, and climbed to inspect a new cone forming at the tip. It was small, tight, fragrant with resin. He cupped it gently as though it might speak. "Vous avez voyagé loin, mon ami," he murmured. "From the Cotswolds to Lebanon to Baker Street. What secrets do you still keep?" The cone, of course, did not answer. But that evening, when Poirot dined alone on sole meunière and a half-bottle of Sauterne, he noticed something on the tablecloth. A single cedar needle, dark and perfect, placed exactly parallel to his knife. Mrs. Murchison swore she had dusted twice. The windows were closed against the August heat. Poirot picked up the needle, twirled it between thumb and finger, and smiled the small, satisfied smile of a man who knows the game is never truly over. He planted the needle beside the seed from Windermere, now sprouted into a second sapling in a porcelain cashpoke. 2 trees now graced the windowsill, their branches intertwining like old friends. Poirot addressed them both. "Messieurs Cedre, you will grow together. One from vengeance, one from forgiveness. Let us see which proves the stronger." Years later, when Poirot's hair had silvered and his steps slowed to the pace of a dignified snail, the cedars filled the flat with their scent. Visitors ducked beneath a green canopy to reach the armchair, where the little detective held court with tisane and memories. The curiosity cabinet had grown to include a Lebanese prayer rug, a bear-claw glove mounted on velvet, and a brass plaque from Beirut. "In gratitude from the heirs of Elias Khoury,